The Empire State Building remains quite energy efficient, right? All these years later, after many interventions. Tell us about how it got that way.
Well, I wouldn't say that the Empire State Building remains energy efficient. I'd say the Empire State Building certainly became energy efficient. And the process was really a partnering. The idea originally came from the Clinton Climate Initiative, then working with Johnson Controls, Jones Lang LaSalle, really partnering with Johnson Controls, Jones Lang LaSalle, and the Rocky Mountain Institute. We did come upon this program, originally going through 67 different potential measures, settling on 8, which in combination gave us what we planned to be a 38.4% reduction in total energy consumption. The reality is it will probably be greater than that based on the fact that in our period to date, we're ahead of where we expected to be as far as actual performance. It's lots of little pieces. There's no silver bullet. Instead, it's what we call silver buckshot. There are 8 parts. The biggest contributor has 9% of the total of 38.4% of the original target. The smallest was 2%, and everything else was between 6 and 3. So that middle piece there, where all the real benefit comes in, really comes from the lots of little pieces, logical steps in the right order, and integrating it into the design and the program.
So what were some of the specific interventions that you undertook to make the Empire State Building as energy efficient as it is today?
Look, the thing that gets the most play is the 6,514 windows that were actually removed in their frames, taken down to a factory we built on the 5th floor of the building, which is really only about 5,500 square feet, looking very much like a finishing floor of a real glass factory, breaking them out of the frames, taking the panes apart, cleaning them, putting in a Mylar sheet, resealing them and filling the vacuum with krypton argon gas, reinstalling them into the frames, and then reinstalling them into the building. 96% of the original glass and frames were reused without ever leaving the building. So that's what people like the most. But we also put in additional insulation, controls of fans and pumps, the largest wireless building control network in the world. And then in addition to that, we of course have the fresh air intake, which gives us the opportunity to use chilled air from the outside, filtering it to take out any impurities in times when it's cool enough outside to be able to cool the building, because in a modern building, in a modern work environment today, there's really air conditioning running 365 days a year.
Now, which of those interventions do you think has lessons for other buildings, and which are particular to this project?
I think they all have lessons in the intervention. I'm not sure I'd use that word, intervention. I'd say that these were different measures. And I think that the other piece of it is, since the very essence of what we're doing is integration, to me intervention means stop this, we're doing this. Integration means while we're doing this, here's a better way to get at the desired goal. You can go to esbsustainability.com. That's E for Empire, S for State, B for Building, esbsustainability.com. And you can look at all the different measures that we looked through. You can even look at the calculations and analyses that were done to get to what we chose to do. The form of contract which we developed, which was novel for its time, which is there for anyone to copy. We didn't patent anything. We didn't decide to own any of this technology. We made this freeware available for the consumption by anyone. And in that regard, I think it has massive lessons. I'll tell you one interesting story. After doing this, I spent time at the Tour Montparnasse in Paris. I think it's best known as being one of the ugliest buildings in the world. And in addition, the building, which was the reason that they prohibited tall buildings within the zone at the center of Paris, and the reason for the construction of La Défense and that whole area out there. But in visiting Tour Montparnasse, talking to them about what we had done, They said, look, we would love to do energy efficiency, but first, look, we have a leaking curtain wall that leaks air and water, creates drafts and lets in heat and humidity in the summer. We have an electric distribution system, which is aluminum. It's failing. We have to redo the electric distribution system. And then our entire heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system is antiquated and needs to be replaced. And if we do these things and we have money left over, then we'll look at energy efficiency. And my comment was, gee, you shouldn't size your heating, cooling system, nor the electricity to power it, until you've done the curtain wall. The integrated right steps, right approach. If you're doing the curtain wall correctly will reduce the heat-cold transfer, reduce the load on cooling. If you put in the correct illumination, it will further, for the offices and hallways, it will further reduce the electricity demand. And then when it comes time actually to put the electric distribution system in, you'll be putting in a much smaller system. The whole thing will cost you less, and you'll have accomplished the energy efficiency piece. So I think this right steps, right order, integrated design, and the whole idea of benchmarking against a target, and then monitoring and verifying what you've done, these are ecumenical. These can be deployed in any building.
That's funny because it's as if they had an energy efficiency project on their hands, but they didn't call it an energy efficiency project. They wanted to replace things in their building, and then literally as an afterthought, undertake an energy efficiency.
Well, I loved what they said, if we have any money left over.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I think most people don't understand. Most people look at the U.S. Green Building Council and the LEED designation, and then they think sustainability is something you have to do. Additional. You have to put in a shower. You have to put in a bike rack. You have to put in a plant wall. You have to put in a water feature. Not one single thing has anything to do with sustainability. I call it's the rich person's qualification. LEED is something for which expensive buildings can apply, or wealthy landowners can apply, because it costs a lot of money and there's no savings. There's no enhancement to the bottom line. Whereas what we're talking about is investment and return. What we devised is an investment and return-oriented system.
Since you brought up LEED, do you think the developments with them in version 4 saying they're going to be more focused on performance and actually measuring building metrics over time instead of just certifying once and saying good job, do you find that to be a positive development? Do you think it's enough?
Well, look, first of all, I think it's anything which has regular commissioning, regular monitoring, verification, and reporting makes sense. It's now required by law in New York City. So now that it's become law in New York City, and by the way, other municipalities, it's quite amazing that the U.S. Green Building Council is now looking to deploy this, by the way, for new buildings only. All right. So I think they're behind the times, if you will. And the other thing, of course, is you can do all that and pay them a fee. So I think that's just a way of saying, okay, we're going to develop a regular routine of getting payments from people. I think actually best practices really shouldn't require you to pay a fee. Best practices should be something which you do because it's in your own selfish interest to have the best result. And I'm glad that LEED is getting around to the concept of monitoring and verification more than just tallying up the points that you win on your scavenger hunt for the pathway to get a certification. But in general, I think that the fact that they look to charge you for this it doesn't sit well with me.
Do you think that code could be better, more prescriptive about incorporating energy efficiency standards, ratcheting up requirements for these things? Or, like you said, is the motivation of savings, its own reward?
I think the motivation for savings should be its own reward. But again, I'll say here in New York City, we have already been working under former Mayor Bloomberg's Greater Green Building Code, Greater Greener Building Code, and that includes the same sort of reporting on energy consumption that was required under filing for Energy Star. And there is a recommissioning requirement under the Greater Greener Building Code, which is the same as people suggest you should do, let's say, under LEED. And I think code is moving forward. And New York City is not alone. You can go to a lot of places which have this focus and have this attention. I think the biggest thing is a general awareness that what we should be working towards is something which makes economic sense, something which is measurable, something which is verifiable out of operating results, not just out of a, as I've said, a tally on a score chart, but actual day to day.
So the Empire State Building reports energy efficiency, energy usage, right? What sort of metrics are available for the public to see about how the building is doing?
You can go on esbsustainability.com and you can get our reporting.
What sort of data exactly?
The monitoring and verification of the energy consumption and savings against our original targets.
Now, this is relatively rare, I gather. Why is it so difficult for buildings and owners to disclose that information?
So imagine that you were in a room full of people and you were told that when you walk out through that door, your social acceptance or rejection will be based on what you're wearing. Or you could stay behind the closed door and continue on with your life the way it is. How many people want to volunteer to go through that door? On the one hand, accolades and success. On the other hand, banishment. Making things public is scary. How do I compare against somebody else? I think that's a threatening view for a lot of people. So they don't want to be judged.
Sure. So what should be done then? Because there's pretty wide agreement that it would be helpful in a lot of ways to move the needle on energy efficiency on a wide basis, on a wide scale, if that data were public and available.
Yeah. So it's funny, first of all, again, in New York City, it is. And I think many municipalities are moving in that direction, counties, municipalities. We haven't seen anything statewide yet. I don't think you'll see anything passed. On a federal level, certainly not until it's on the books. I mean, typically federal law that regulates things locally only gets put on the books when it's already present in more than 50% of the area which it's regulating already. So that's one piece. I think the federal piece is already there. I'd say the second piece is there are a lot of opportunities presented to people to distinguish themselves. That's certainly what we've done at the Empire State Building. What we did was to distinguish ourselves by determining that we had a good result and publicizing it. And I think hopefully that will motivate other people, shame other people, cajole other people, inspire them to do similar work.
And have you heard any examples recently of that inspiration reaching one of the other many aging mid-century or older, less efficient buildings that are out there in New York?
Okay, let's be fair about something. You're talking about mid-century. I'm assuming you mean mid-20th century.
Sure.
So,
Yeah,
so if you look at the modern glass box inventory in New York, many of those modern buildings from the 1970s are getting close to 50 years old.
Right.
Right? So it's not just aging or older mid-century or beginning of the century. The fact is, if you haven't replaced systems, windows, elevators, cooling, heating, lighting, if you haven't inserted the concept of insulation for 40 or 50 years, even though you may look like a glass box building, modern lobby, the whole building's in need of a total retrofit anyway. All right, that's number one. Number two, you've got everything from, I think it's called the Century Tower in Melbourne, Australia, all the way to Moscone Center in San Francisco. I could come up with a list of buildings where they are actually taking the lessons that we learned and made broadly available and either have or are deploying them point by point. The other thing we learned is interesting is that really 60% of the energy consumed in an office building is consumed by the tenants.
Right.
So you have the split incentive where the tenants occupy space, the landlords have the building. If the landlord spends money in the tenant space, tenants in New York paying for their own electricity, the landlord spending money for the tenant's benefit. Energy Star is a rating which rates entire whole building consumption. So we came up with this realization. We went down to the EPA and we said, look, Energy Star is something great towards which everyone aspires. It's not really mandated by LEED. Tenant installations don't have anything having to do with energy efficiency. They're the biggest consumers of power in a building, office building. We should have a standard for Energy Star for tenant installations. People at EPA said that's a great idea, but we take our instructions in the Department of Energy. We merely implement the rules they put together. I went to the Department of Energy. They said, we think that's a great idea, but we only make the rules as we're instructed to do so by Congress. So I had to get a bill passed. So earlier this year, in April of 2015, we did get a bill passed. It might have been May. But in any event, it creates something called Tenant Star. Tenant Star is a 3-phase program. The rules are being made by the Department of Energy. They will be implemented by the EPA. It's voluntary. You get no cash incentive. You do get a cash benefit by having a tenant design and construction which follows these rules. And the pieces which matter, as far as I am concerned, is that it does motivate people to address something which is much easier to do than a whole building retrofit, build out tenant installations that are more energy efficient. There's a design and construction phase, which is part 1. There's a measurement and reporting phase, which is part 2. And then over time, there will be a consumption, relative consumption rated award similar to Energy Star. But in the meantime, we've got a great program that's been put together. It was passed into law, first piece of energy policy passed by the Congress and signed into law in a dozen years. So we're pretty pleased about that.